So at any point, if you have a question, like, feel free, because we can take this conversation different direction even than what I have planned. So, but let's just kind of start with defining the term. And so, we are obviously, as Christians, we all come from different walks of life. Some who grew up in the church as Christians.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. And then you said you grew up
I grew up
Catholic. So, you grew up in the church. Who came to Christian faith later in life? Oh, okay. And both. Okay. So, we have the complex issue of denominations in Christianity and trying to understand that. So, just trying to bring some clarity to that. And like I said, if you have questions, feel free, ask away, because it'll only help and benefit you in the discussion today. So, denominations, I'm just kind of defining that. Within Christianity, you have the subset of different little groups or sects that, S-E-C-T, that kind of are defined by what they believe and what they teach, but for the most part, they're still under the umbrella of Orthodox Christianity. And so I have two different terms there in bold that I want to define, just because as I use them, I want to make sure that you know what I'm talking about. So if I'm using the term Orthodox, I'm not typically referring to the Eastern Orthodox churches. That would be more, Turkey, Greece, Russia, kind of that Eastern Europe range. At some point, I might talk about Eastern Orthodox, but for the most part, if I'm using the term Orthodox, I'm just meaning it in its kind of more broad sense, the lowercase o, as being right teaching, right doctrine. And believe it or not, there has been Orthodox Christian teachings pretty much since the time of Jesus. That's what kind of classifies as the main vein of what is correct teaching, what's correct doctrine. That's what the Orthodox means. And so we want to, obviously, as most Christians, we want to fall in line with that and not be believing in beliefs or teachings that are opposite or opposing to Orthodox teaching. So that's what that means, orthodoxy, just kind of correct teaching, correct doctrine. And then orthopraxy is correct practice. And so how you do things, doing it correctly type of thing. And believe it or not, those are the two main things that are going to both unite but also divide Christianity. So on one hand, you have the teachings and practices that fall in line with what Christianity is and what it should be and what it should look like since the time of Christ. And so it can be a unifying factor in that, but it also is then what can divide, because as different denominations, as we will see in a little bit, pop up, they typically differ more times than not on the practices of maybe the mode of baptism or the mode of the Lord's Supper or what exactly that means and everything. And so while they can be unifying, they can also be divisive in that. And so that's kind of the line we have to keep a part of throughout when we talk about church history and really just what it means to follow God, is try to keep those in balance of making sure that we are teaching and believing correct orthodoxy teaching, but then also doing it in the right manner. And you could even add maybe a third one. I didn't put this on there, but orthopathy with correct attitude, because even in 1 Corinthians 13, when it's talking about the spiritual gifts and how all of those fall under the category of, or should be done out of love. if we do all of these Christian things, but we don't have love, then what are they? They're just a resounding gong or a clanging cymbal. And so even in that, like as Christians, like we should also not just strive for correct doctrine and teaching and, correct practice, but also from the right attitude, that we do it with a Christ-like approach, out of love and humility and serving one another. And so, so keep that in mind, that while we're going to kind of talk about these different denominations, maybe different beliefs, then ultimately, though, the thing is, like, we are still trying to follow Christ to the best of our ability, and we want everyone to do that as well. And so trying to move towards a more unified Christian faith is definitely the goal. So then branches of Christianity, I would say maybe, and this is me, I didn't necessarily ground it in anything, but your three main branches: Roman Catholic, Eastern Orthodox, so that's where you get the big O for Orthodox, but because they do definitely have a definite set of beliefs that kind of keeps them separate from Roman Catholicism. And then the third one is Protestant. And so this is kind of a lot of definition of terms right now, but if you hear the term Protestant, that is where, we fall under the Protestant Reformation, and I'm going to talk about in just a few moments. But those are kind of your three main branches of Christianity: Roman Catholic, Eastern Orthodox, and Protestant. Can anybody think of any others that you would say are main branches? Because like I said, I didn't actually look this up. I just put it on the paper. So,
where does the Latter-day Saints fall?
They still kind of technically follow under the Protestant, but then depending on understanding of beliefs and doctrines, some might keep them a part of that, and some might put them in a different category as well. So,
first one came to mind for me was Amish.
Yep.
They're not Protestant. They don't really count themselves as Protestant.
Yeah, but there's still so I looked at different different family trees this week, and they still kind of get lumped in there just because of, you do have, up until the Protestant Reformation, your only option was to be Roman Catholic or Eastern Orthodox. But then after that, then it created opportunities for other branches. And so they're still kind of a part of that, because, and I think I will mention them, more of we'll mention them. So, but still kind of loosely under the Protestant Reformation.
Messianic Jews, would that be Christian?
True. What do you think, Randy?
Christian.
Because that could definitely be a fourth branch.
Possible. By definition, all Jewish people are Messianic.
Okay.
Deciding who is
Okay.
the it certainly wouldn't. Maybe a sub-branch of your Christian in 325 when we had the Nicene Council split. That's where the Eastern Orthodox, the Western Orthodox, which is the Roman Catholic Church. So it might fall more under your Eastern Orthodox and the Jacobite Church of Syria and two more. Anyway,
Yeah.
somewhere in that division.
Okay. And you may be a category all of its own, because you, as Jews, that's our heritage anyway, and so you supersede the branches of Christianity.
So, for Messianic Jews, they all believe in a Messiah, or some believe that Jesus.
Well, to Messiah is the general term that, every Jew believed the Messiah was coming, or was going to come. And so, and if you are in a Messianic congregation today, anybody who's Orthodox or conservative or even Reformed would not consider you a Jew anymore.
Interesting.
Is that a split off of the Sadducees?
It doesn't go that far back. I mean, typically, all your first generation Christians were Jewish. It wasn't until about 200 that Christianity became not just a sect or division of Judaism, but became its own thing. So it's it's kind of confusing. I'm not splitting hairs, but it's difficult to define that. I mean, people say that all the time. Well, are you Messianic? Everyone is Messianic by definition.
Well, yeah, when you read the book of Acts, like Paul's argument in the book of Acts is that Christianity is still part of Judaism. It's the fulfillment of the scriptures, because in Roman period, Judaism was a legal religion, and only certain faith practices were allowed. And so for Christianity to be a new religion would make it illegal. And so Paul has to, and rightly so, but, talk about how it's still part of Judaism because it's the fulfillment of what God was doing in our Old Testament. And so that's a lot of what the argument in the book of Acts is Paul just trying to defend that, no, it really is which is why when they're in Corinth and the proconsul says, oh, if you're arguing about matters of your own religion, I don't have time for it, and dismisses the case. And Paul was able to then continue to preach in Corinth because it was seen as just within the Jewish faith, just matters of doctrine and understanding. So yeah. Well, to define a few more terms for Protestant. So since we are in the Protestant Reformation, Protestant kind of give you overview. This is not actually how I would have outlined it, but I looked at Michael Burge's political science book, The Nuns, and this is how he defined it based on our surveys and censuses in the U.S. and how they break down religion. And I was like, oh, well, I'm going to keep that then. But this is not actually how I would have done it right away. But he talks about how Protestant denominations, you have your evangelical Protestants, and I'm kind of giving you some terms here at the beginning, and then between this class and then in 2 weeks, some of these terms will get defined a little bit more and we'll look at it. But you have your non-denominational, so that's what we are here at Christ Church. Non-denominational meaning, we don't hold to any denominational committee or oversight. But then within the evangelical Protestants, your Southern Baptists, your Assembly of Gods, your Free Methodists, and your Lutheran Church Missouri Synod are kind of in that evangelical group. But then your mainline Protestants are going to be your United Methodists, your Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, your Presbyterian Church, your Episcopal, American Baptist Church, Disciples of Christ, United Church of Christ. And then you have black Protestants there with black Southern Baptists. And he, in the book, kind of talked about how just because of culture and everything, how even that's its own subcategory, just because of their beliefs and practices. So we'll get into some of this in more detail, but that's just kind of giving you an oversight of what the term Protestant can even mean, because that term can get thrown out there a lot. And I know growing up, every time we had to take a standardized test and I just remember one time in high school, we had to put our faith, and I grew up in the church and I was like, I don't know what I'm supposed to put. And my teacher was like, yeah, you just, mark that because that's what you are. And it's like, oh, okay. Because I didn't always know what, Protestant meant. And so sometimes these terms get thrown out there and we don't always know what they mean. So if you have questions and want clarity, make sure to ask. But But for the most part, how did we get here? So this is my history lesson for today. I will try not to make it too terribly long for you, but just kind of give you a very quick and brief overview of some church history things and how we got here. So for the most part, if you were going to be a Christian and you were following Christ, for the most part, for the first 1,000 years of church history, you were just a part of the church. As Randy mentioned, yes, as the different councils happened in 300, 400, 4th, 5th centuries, you do have some breaking off, more so from typically when the councils voted on what was orthodox, should be considered orthodox, lower O, then the ones that would break off typically would kind of be more understood as like heretical or maybe not following that vein. So for the most part, for the first 1,000 years, like you were going to be part of the Catholic, lower C, universal church, just because there was only one church. But as tensions arose in the Roman Empire, really, I mean, if you study Roman history, I mean, Rome fell in 465, I think, or something like that. But even before that, when Constantine in 300 moved the capital from Rome to Byzantium, which is now known Constantinople, like Rome just had issues. And so for the next 600-700 years, like there were tensions in the church because really just over languages and practices, because in the East you spoke Greek, in the West, in Rome, you spoke Latin, and who's better than who? Is Rome more prominent than the East and Constantinople? And so just in Roman history, there's tensions. The East started becoming more wealthy and powerful when, the Rome fell in the West, and just conflict back and forth. But for the most part, the church was still kind of united. But then 1054 AD, that's the Great Schism, where you officially at that point have the Eastern Orthodox and the Roman Catholic being separated, and both leaders of those churches excommunicating the other, and just kind of a nasty division that still has not been resolved today, honestly. So, it's going to be theological, geographical, political, every reason you probably can have in there, like it's going to be a part of that. But that's going to happen really 1,000 years. So for the most part, the church was fairly unified and singly, not necessarily singly focused, but like for the most part unified as you were just a Christian up until that time period. But then over the next 400-500 years, as the world in the West changed, we're going from, so 1054, that's definitely, you're in the height of the Middle Ages. So if you're thinking any movie or anything like that, that's kind of Middle Ages, knights, crusades, anything like that, that's kind of the time period, Middle Ages. But as you're coming out of that, part of what is bringing the Middle Ages into a new worldview and kind of shifting away from that Middle Ages is a lot of education. Colleges were starting to pop up, higher learning was starting to pop up. People were getting reintroduced to Greek mythology and Greek language and just the Greek philosophy and way of life. And you mix all of everything that was happening in the world together, you start getting pretty much everything that goes on in the world anyway. Geographical conflicts, political conflicts, socio-economical, theological conflicts. And coming out of the Middle Ages, you have a church that, while we may be considered the bride of Christ, the parts of the church that were in the public eye that were more noticeable by people was not always the best. I'm sure for every, one bad story of, you hear in the, even in the news today of Christians, like there's probably 10 good stories of ways that God has worked in the quietness of someone's life and helped this person out in that. But that's not always what we hear. Sometimes we always see, the negative rather than see what the good is. But within that, all of that time period, you have the Roman Catholic Church that just had several issues. There's no way around that. Corruption, greed. It had lost itself within the Middle Ages in a sense of trying to figure out its place in the world, because at that point you had the Holy Roman Empire where the Pope and the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire was kind of always in a battle of who had the most power. And as long as the Pope, was seen as higher power than the Roman Empire, like that was good for the Pope, but the Holy Roman Emperor would want to have the power over the Pope. And so it was just kind of a battle back and forth. So there were practices, there were just different things going on that needed reformed. And so the Protestant Reformation, and I know that does not give you really any specifics on any of the history lesson of what was happening in that time period, but the Protestant Reformation is birthed out of this desire, for the most part at the beginning, this desire to reform the church from within. Not trying to start a new branch of Christianity, but like Martin Luther, he's kind of the first one that is always talked about in terms of Protestant Reformation. But Martin Luther, who was a German under the Holy Roman Empire, but he was a priest. He was, in the Roman Catholic Church. So he went off, became a priest, studied at different universities and schools. And as he's working through Scripture, he saw things in Scripture that contradicted some of their practices and teachings, mainly the idea of penance and being justification of faith and stuff like that. But his initial desire was not to start something new, but it was to bring reform from the church and correct it like that. And so the Protestant Reformation, it was seeking to reform, bring change. Now, the opposition that arose from that against the teachings of the Catholic Church, from whether it was from the Pope or even the Emperor, because there were some family conflicts there of the Emperor didn't want to go against. No, basically he kept Luther quiet because his family relative was related to the Pope or something like that. So there's just differences there. But Martin Luther wanted to reform it, and the famous one for what starts the Protestant Reformation is he nailed 95 statements or theses on the door of the Wittenberg Church, and that's kind of what started the Protestant Reformation. But really just trying to bring change, looking to change some of the practices, but when you're dealing with systems of power and structure that have been in place for a few hundred years, that doesn't always change easily. And so because of the response of the Roman Catholic Church, they excommunicated Luther, which then forced him into being protected by some of the German princes, basically forced a new branch of Christianity to happen that possibly could have been avoided if the reform would have taken place within the Catholic Church when Luther was issuing his theses. Yes,
Just want to break your train of thought.
go for it.
When Martin Luther did his 95
Mm-hmm.
thesis, was he claiming that was divine revelation, prophetic? What was his basis for making these theses?
As far as I know, he wasn't necessarily claiming, new inspiration from God or prophetic, but it really was looking at the practices of the church. And because he had been studying the Bible, seeing that some of those practices are not grounded in Scripture. And so it was a way of putting ideas out there to discuss, to debate. So it wasn't necessarily like a manifesto or anything like that, but it was, hey, in my reading of Scripture, I have issues with these practices, let's debate them, let's talk about them.
So they weren't absolutes necessarily.
I don't think so. They were more trying to look at the practices and I have issues or let's talk about them.
Is this scriptural versus what mankind has interpreted to be?
So when he's called before the emperor and he's told to recant and take back what he said, his answer was, if there's anything that I've said that is against Scripture, I will recant that. But if there's anything that is in line with what Scripture says, I'm not going to recant that, which was still problematic. Even though his answer was right, it still was problematic because he had beliefs about certain practices in the Catholic Church that he wasn't going to
Similar
go
to what
against.
Jesus would have done had he been called before the Sadducees and Pharisees.
Hmm.
Similar to what Paul would have done had he been called before.
I haven't thought about it like that.
I think you're exactly on the right. I'm just gonna use that example when they talk about the Pharisees, being
Yeah.
this, we do this and this and that. Well, why? Because it doesn't say that. Well, we've adopted this. So it's a local custom that became a law, which really wasn't.
And I do need to clarify too that when I'm talking about Roman Catholic Church of the Middle Ages, it looks different than the Roman Catholic Church today. They do have their own Reformation that comes out of this, and so some of their teachings and practices from this time period, coming out of the Middle Ages, looks different than the Catholic Church today. So that needs to be said because, in here you have indulgences and penance and purgatory. And so that was a big one for Luther. Because you have the backstory, you have crusades going on, you have building projects where they're building the big cathedrals. You have a need for money and to pay off the crusades, pay for these great building projects. And so beliefs start being propagated that, if you want to make sure that your relative who maybe has died or is dying has a better chance of eternity in heaven and gets there quicker, think Dante's Inferno, if you've ever read that or heard about that, or there's different levels of between hell and heaven and different things like that. If you want to speed that along, then if you pay an indulgence and give money to the Roman Catholic Church, then we will make sure that happens. We'll pray on their behalf and
Intercede on your behalf.
yeah, and make sure that happens.
Right amount of money.
And let me be clear, because all of indulgences and penance, these are beliefs that were in the Middle Ages that during the Reform, they have ceased to carry them into the Roman Catholic Church for the last few hundred years. But that was some of those beliefs. And so Luther was pushing back on some of those teachings because when his big thing was the justification of what God does for us, and not by our works in terms of giving money to the church and different things like that. And so he's bringing about reform, and I mean, there's so much more to be said about Luther, but he's really kind of the spark. But at the same time, like while he's over here in Germany, then you have a couple other people that are starting to pop up that Ulrich Zwingli, who is happening at the same time, but not necessarily connected to Luther. But you have him, you have John Calvin, that's going to come a little bit, this 10 or so years, I think, later. But you're going to have a couple different really big people who are going to make a big impact on Christianity that are all starting to kind of ask these same questions, and ask, really, I mean, I put it in here, they're going to start asking the questions of what is salvation? What does it mean to be saved? Because, in the Roman Catholic Church, it very much was, you stay close to the church, you offer, your penance and pay your indulgences, you keep the sacraments, like that is how you make sure that you are experiencing salvation. But these other reformers are starting to ask, okay, what does it mean to be saved? Is it by what we do, or is it by what God has done for us through Jesus? They're asking questions of, and this is really probably the biggest one, authority. And I mean, that's a shocker, because I think every generation struggles with authority at some point. But they're asking a question of, where does religious authority come from? Is it from Scripture? Is it through the Pope? Is it through tradition? Is it through the councils? Because also think in this time period, most people, even though the world was changing at this time, like most people are still fairly illiterate, and the Catholic Church had a very hold on the Bible. It was only authorized to be translated in Latin, and the common folk at this time didn't speak Latin. So only the religious leaders could read or teach the Bible. The common person couldn't, didn't have a Bible. They had to go to Mass in order to get that. And so as part of the world shifting and people becoming educated and studying for themselves, that was another thing that Luther was, because, when he reads the Bible for the, first couple times, like he's confronted then with what Scripture says versus the traditions and teachings that he had grew up in, and so wanted to get the Bible into the common language. Well, that was a big deal, big no-no, and so, but that sense of authority, where does authority come from? Like that's a big question. And even the Catholic Church was asking those questions. So it's really on everyone's mind, because who do we listen to? They're also asking questions about how the church relates to the world, because at this point the Roman Catholic Church is very much intertwined with the Holy Roman Empire, and so you have this mix of theological, religious, faith life being married to a geographical, political country that is, very much involved in the world's affairs. And so you have that blending of religious and political power. And so the reformers are asking these questions of how does the church relate to the world? And, it's understandable why they're asking that. But then also, who can interpret the Bible? Is it a limited priesthood or not? Is it only the trained bishops and archbishops and, the Pope type of thing? Or is it, should the everyday Christian be able to read the Bible? And so what developed was, for the most part, even though Protestants is not a unified movement by any means, it does kind of have a few hallmark characteristics, and a couple of those are for the most part, Protestants reject a limited priesthood, meaning, they really do see that kind of going with the point below it, that the Bible should be in the common language so that way every Christian has access to it, can read it and interpret it. And so because of that, being a minister or being a priest, like, doesn't need to be as held as closely as what it was being held at that time period in the Roman Catholic Church. Now, even within that, Protestant, I mean, Lutherans, like, they still have their levels of leadership, and you have different denominations that have your levels, and so priesthood can still kind of be limited in that sense, but for the most part, it has to deal with letting everyone be able to read the Bible and interpret it and be kind of a minister in that thing. But then they reduced the number of sacraments to 2, baptism and Lord's Supper. And so that's also very much a kind of a cross-Protestant traditions. Pretty much anywhere you go, like, those are going to be the 2 that are going to be emphasized, is baptism, Lord's Supper. Now, as I hope all of us are aware, the ways in which you practice those, that is what gets discussed and everything like that. But for the most part, sacraments gets focused on baptism and Lord's Supper because those are the 2 that Jesus institutes or seemingly institutes in his ministry and through the early church. And so the other sacraments aren't necessarily found there. But then, so the kind of the conclusion of that is the Protestant Reformation, while it was definitely necessary, and a lot of good things have happened from it, it definitely was not a unified movement. And that is kind of the hard thing, is whenever you go from having the authority of, say, the councils, the church councils that have a unifying authoritative voice over the church, and even the Pope or his bishops and archbishops and leaders and stuff like that, like, you start getting voices here and there that are going to pop up, and so it becomes very disunified very quickly, which is to be understandable. And so that's a very quick overview of the Protestant Reformation without really any of the main specifics, but those are your big names: Martin Luther, Ulrich, Zwingli, John Calvin, and then I also put and Henry VIII and the Anabaptists. Henry VIII, he separated really just because he wanted divorced from his wife so he could marry his mistress, and that in case she had a son, because she was pregnant at the time, that if she could have a son, that he would be the rightful heir to the throne and not his daughter from his previous wife. So he so much wasn't necessarily looking to reform it based on tradition, but more out of his precarious life situation at that moment to secure the throne for his family. And then the Anabaptists, that's where your Mennonites and your Amish are going to come out of, are the Anabaptists. So they are popping up at the same time, which is why they're grouped in the Protestant Reformation, even though they are the ones that really kind of get pushed out of the Protestant Reformation by the other Protestants. So
what was kind of their signature? I remember reading that back and I don't remember anything.
Anabaptists, based on their name, they were the rebaptizers. So they were honestly like the first ones to believe that baptism should be for the more like adult believer. Because even at this point, you still had infant baptism being practiced in the church. And so Anabaptists were really the first ones that viewed baptism as being something for the believer. And so they would rebaptize people, which is how they got the name Anabaptists. And I don't know why. I really haven't been able to figure this out yet, but they were the ones that were pushed out and even persecuted by other Protestants and even the Catholic Church, but mainly the other Protestants for their beliefs. And in every book I've read so far, it's like they mention the Anabaptists, but then it doesn't ever tell you like why they were pushed out and persecuted, but they very much, some of it had to do with their beliefs of like wanting to separate themselves from the world more so than the other kind of traditions, but still, they were the ones pushed out. So they get a mention in most books, but that's about it. So, but then that's all I can do too, because I haven't really found a good answer for it. So that is the Protestant Reformation. So you really, that was the spark that kind of set in motion the rise of denominations and this more disunity within the church, because now you have different voices that are able to put their mark on Christianity and express themselves in different ways. And so you start having, kind of what we experience today. Now you start having people interacting with Scripture, interacting with doctrine and teachings, and forming different groups. And so in the West, in Europe, in America, over the next 150 years or so, like it very quickly explodes into many different little denominations. I mean, it just kind of splits between several different things, and oftentimes they also are tied in with political reasons too, because that's this time period, that's when the world is, like, the European countries are starting to colonize the West and different places in the world, and so they're exploring, they're asking questions, there's scientific advancements, stuff like that, and there's just a lot. The printing press is invented, and so, like, we all know how social media has changed the world drastically. That's what the printing press did back then, just a little bit on a slower scale, but it got ideas out there, and so it started changing how people saw and understood and interacted in the world. So it became very disunited. And so America, really England and America, but as we are influenced by science, rational thought, philosophy, secularism, the idea that you can live life without God is starting to rise, starting to become more natural, normal occurrences in the world. And so, but really the shift that happened in the 17th, 18th centuries is Christianity became very intellectual, very much based on rational, logical thought. It was all kind of a religion of the mind in terms of we have to validate everything, we have to think through and logically explain everything. And so, but it also, when you do that with Christianity, you also lose some of the relationship, the personal side of faith, the emotional response, the kind of how our faith is living and active and life-giving in a sense. And so then whenever people start reclaiming that side of Christianity, that is what sparks revival. That's what sparks people being drawn into faith, because it's more than just a logical argument or something to prove, but it's something that we can draw upon and live in. And so what happens is about 1801, there's a revival at Cane Ridge in Kentucky, and you can go there today. I've been there. It's a small little log cabin church inside of a building to keep it protected. But they had a revival where Barton W. Stone was interested in just having people from all different denominations come and worship God. And there was a revival that broke out. Still some aspects of faith that, depending on who you listen to or who you read, like, describe it differently, but something happened. People repented. It definitely seems like the revival was there, but a revival broke out, and that is kind of the start of what we would call the Restoration movement. Barton W. Stone meets up with Alexander Campbell. They start promoting this idea that, like, let's throw off some of these terms and barriers that keep us from being united with each other, and let's just call ourselves Christians. That's kind of their idea, was let's just drop these denominational ties and let's just call ourselves disciples, call ourselves Christians, and not give precedent to different creeds and confessions, because they were definitely desiring not unity just for the sake of unity, but for fellowship and world evangelism, because every little denomination would have a different creed or a different confession, that if you wanted to associate with us, if you wanted to gather with us, then you had to accept that creed or confession. And so by getting rid of that, it allowed you then to fellowship with other people more freely, because you didn't have to make that confession of that confessional or creed. And so they really started promoting this idea that let's return to the New Testament. Let's not just try to be united, but let's return to the picture we see in the book of Acts and live like the New Testament church. Let's go back to that. So that's kind of where this idea of restore comes from, is going back to the original. So their statement that says, in essentials of faith, unity, in matters of opinion, liberty, and in all things, love. That's kind of the restoration movement. If we had a statement, that would be it. That we need to be united in the essentials of faith, but in secondary and tertiary matters, third matters, like we need to have some liberty. We can have flexibility, but in all things we need to love. And so that's the movement that birthed Christian churches, churches of Christ, disciples of Christ. So that is the movement that we are part of, that we come out of as Christ Church. Is we are part of the restoration movement of trying to be united and be able to not look at denominational barriers, but be united on the principles of faith. So all of that, since service is almost out, questions that you might be asking. So this is what I came up with. Is there a right denomination? How broad is the term Christian? What denominations are included? Because I even got that asked this week of, would you consider a Roman Catholic, people who are Catholics, Christian and going to heaven? And my answer was yes, but my understanding of Christianity is pretty broad in that sense. But that's a question you have to ask when you start getting into denominations. Where do we draw the line between Orthodox Christianity and cults that distort the gospel message? And I'll kind of end on this, and then we'll just kind of have like 2 minutes of questions if you want. But better questions to ask, just to ponder, to think about, I think, is how do we remain united with other Christians, even in the most broad sense? How do we do that? How do we maintain that mindset? How do we stay focused on the purpose and mission of following Jesus, even when we do have differences on second and third level issues in Christianity? And those two flow into this third one of, what type of people are we becoming? Are we becoming more like Christ or not? And so that should be a driving force, I think, for all of us in our own lives, but also in our churches as a whole, of like, are we becoming more like Christ or not? And so if by maintaining these differences, if it's making us act in ways that are contrary to Christ, then we probably need to stop that and think about see how we can become more like Christ. And then, are we portraying the gospel message correctly in our lives and through our churches? So a little exercise that you should do this week, because that's what I did, is I say we need a firm understanding of the gospel message and agree on the gospel message and the primary issues. And so I thought I was going to be like just a really quick, like, oh, here's the gospel message that we should agree on. And then as I started typing it out, I'm like, oh yeah, there's this, and then there's this, and then there's this, and then there's this. And we kind of probably, like, that's kind of a key thing. And so, like, I mean, I have 5 things just right there with, you know, most of them have subpoints. So it's just kind of interesting. Oh, no, 6. I have one on the back. Of go through this week and maybe say, type out, like, what is the gospel? What does that mean? And what are kind of the primary things of faith? And then maybe look at my list and compare and contrast. And then come back and talk with me on what you think should be added, what you think should be taken away, or anything like that.